Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. It's a little after 11 right now. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning for a great conversation on blockchain for autonomous systems. We're very excited to have several experts joining us this morning to share their real-world insights on this topic from Boeing NeXt, XY, and Perkins Coie. On a quick housekeeping note, we're going to save some room for the end of this panel to have some questions, and I know there'll be several. But in the meantime, feel free to tweet your insights using the hashtag for the conference, hashtag AUVSI XPO. So my name is Dan Spuller, and I represent Washington's Chamber of Digital Commerce. This is the world's largest blockchain trade association that promotes the use and acceptance of digital assets and blockchain-based technologies. My background had been in public administration with the North Carolina Department of Commerce, Banking Commissioner's Office, and Department of Transportation. So I had a background in policy and regulations, but a passion for this technology. And so as long as there's been people, there's been an interest in flight. And technology has always been the bridge to get us there. Last month, I had a wonderful opportunity to participate in a discussion at the U.S. Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C., where they were commemorating the 500th anniversary of the death of Leonardo da Vinci back in 1519, a true polymath for his time. And the topic was space, destination over the past 500 years, and it had pundits from NASA, Blue Origin, and SpaceX. But one of Da Vinci's favorite concepts was the idea of human flight, and he's often credited with conceptualizing and sketching out ornithopters and flying machines, which was certainly far ahead of his time. And it made me realize how far we've come so far as a society, where we're going, and what can we expect next. And this morning, we're going to be talking about blockchain on that topic, and the impact this can have on unmanned systems and beyond. So I'd like now to have our distinguished panelists introduce themselves, tell them a little bit about their background and their company, and then we'll get started with some questions.
Great, can you guys hear this, or should I hold it? Hold it. There we go. So my name is Jon Damush. I'm a director inside Boeing NeXt. My group is called New Business Ventures. For those of you who haven't heard of Boeing NeXt, what we are is a part of Boeing associated with our sibling organization called Horizon X. And it's our job to look to the future of mobility, invest and execute projects to progress the state of the art in terms of technologies, but also in terms of regulatory operations, and explore these areas so that we can extend a strategy for the next 100 years and the future of flight as the Boeing company.
Hello, my name is Charlyn Ho. I am an attorney at the law firm of Perkins Coie. We are one of the probably foremost blockchain law firms in the country, and my particular practice focuses on all things technology related, intellectual property, data governance, data privacy, especially as it relates to unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned systems, and blockchain technology.
Hello, I'm Arie Trouw. I'm the founder of XY and XPO. XPO is a blockchain protocol and company that provides data sovereignty and uses cryptography to be able to do trustless data sharing, basically. We're one of the few, perhaps the only blockchain company that is Regulation A+ qualified by the SEC, and so we are probably at the bleeding edge of some of the regulation questions as far as blockchain and the U.S. government, and also, of course, since we're U.S. based, that's different than many blockchain companies out there. But we definitely focus on data signing and trustless data sharing.
Thank you so much for those great introductions. I'm just going to jump right in. John, Boeing has had a tremendous success these past 100 years, and you yourself have had the opportunity to be at the forefront of several exciting UAS projects these past years, ranging from unmanned solutions to track wildfires, patrol Coast Guard vessels, other military operations. By integrating blockchain into these projects, what are some specific use cases that most excite you, and how can DLT benefit the future of mobility, manned and unmanned?
Yeah, so frankly, historically, there hasn't been a whole lot of application of blockchain or DLT technologies in the aviation space. And most of what you've seen in the UAS space, and by way of background, I was with our subsidiary in situ for 3.5 years, which makes the Scan Eagle and Integrator UAVs, which have really long endurance, and they're basically semi-autonomous aircraft that you give waypoints and they go and fly and look at the things that you care about. But we really didn't explore the use of the technology in those areas, but we could have, right? As we invest in this space as Boeing NeXt and start to execute new concepts, one of them that falls under my area of responsibility is a joint venture that we just launched called SkyGrid. And it's a joint venture between Boeing and a company in Austin, Texas called Spark Cognition, which is headed by a fellow named Amir Hussein, and they're one of the leaders in the productization of artificial intelligence and blockchain technologies to solve complex business problems. So probably the most interesting area for me looking forward in the application of this technology is when you start talking about airspace management, equipment management, and frankly, operator management. As you start to see these systems of very complex, large numbers of air vehicles doing a wide variety of aviation tasks, and for a wide variety of stakeholders, which are decidedly not aviation people. The operators of drone fleets in the future are not going to be pilots, certainly not in the way that Boeing thinks of pilots. The word trusted operator is used quite a lot in industry. I think that's an interesting concept. But if you really fast forward and you start to see where unmanned systems can offer tremendous economic value, it's when they are just an adjunct to someone's existing job. They become an appliance. So as these systems become appliances and do things more autonomously, literally the vision that we have is if you're an infrastructure manager, what you want to do is you want to come into your control room in the morning and see green dots on the map for where your infrastructure is. You don't want to care about the, how long has it been since the last, drone serial number 225 has been inspected. You don't want to try to track all of your batteries. You need systems to do those things for you. As those systems become more autonomous, there is a risk in losing trust in what those systems are doing and what they have done, especially as we start talking about exploring the world of artificial intelligence and allowing them to make pseudo-cognitive decisions on the operation of these systems and fleets. So how do we maintain that trust? And our view of it is, well, first is transparency. And DLT offers us a way to provide that transparency to every stakeholder in the system or outside the system. That's one of the benefits of the technology. The other aspect is security. As these systems do more and more on their own, they're going to be communicating peer-to-peer. It's not necessarily going to be centralized. So as you start doing that, and the autonomous systems are able to make more decisions around aviation navigation, you need to track all of those interactions. You need to know what was going on in the system, so that when some incident does occur, which it will, there is a legacy, there's a lineage that can be followed, and we can learn from that. We can secure against bad actors using these types of technologies. So this is really kind of where we're focused and where we start to get excited because, transparency, trust, accountability, that's what these technologies, at least from our view, from the application side of things, really bring to the table for this new era of aviation.
Thank you for that. And certainly these other emerging technologies that we're seeing beyond blockchain are starting to collide. And Charlyn, we had a terrific conversation earlier this morning on that very topic. So Perkins is one of the original has one of the original blockchain practices actually, and it's certainly been terrific to work with your firm these past years. What distinguishes blockchain from other cutting edge technologies, and why do you think blockchain is useful for these companies with relation to autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it relates a lot to what John was talking about, is that as systems become more and more autonomous, there needs to be a way for them to communicate with one another and share data with one another without going through a central point, which is just going to be kind of a stopping point for the information flow. So blockchain as a distributed ledger offers functionality for a broad-based read-only access to data on a real-time basis across a distributed network. So as you have these various autonomous systems that are all moving independently, having a ledger on which all parties can view the data in real time, I think is one advantage of blockchain technology over perhaps some other technologies that might solve the same problem. I mean, of course, it's not the only way to address the problem. It just offers a few advantages that perhaps, you know, a traditional centralized cloud-based system may not. The other thing about the blockchain, I think, that offers advantages is the immutability aspect of it and the fact that all transactions are chronologically recorded and chained together. So, you know, as we go through life and we need to go and verify records, nowadays you have to go through individual silos and piece together information like a puzzle. But if it was all in one repository where there was trust in that system, even though the actors themselves don't necessarily know each other, and you can independently trust that data, the veracity of the data, and that it hasn't been tampered with, I think that's another added benefit of having blockchain technology in this space.
And do you see this emerging with smart cities or with ride-hailing companies? I mean, do you think that's going to be part of this next 2 to 3 years or beyond?
Absolutely. I think with autonomous vehicles, they can't exist independently. Autonomous vehicles need to communicate with other things, including each other, but also, as we were talking about earlier, you know, lights, curbs, sidewalks, you know, fire hydrants, charging stations, all of these items that are integral to the infrastructure and ecosystem of an autonomous world. The only way that we're going to develop this ecosystem is if all of these items are smart in a way. Because an individual, an individual operator can't be managing all of this data in real time. It's just too much. One human or many humans are just not capable of doing that. So we need to have some sort of system, probably eventually going towards a smart city where we can all communicate with one another. I think privacy and security are obviously one of the risk factors that would undermine the speed of advancement in this space. But I think that there's a lot of promise for the technology.
Yeah, certainly. So, Arie, can you talk a little bit about the dataism movement? What is this mode of thinking, and why is it, in your opinion, increasingly important in the society we live in?
So dataism, for you guys who aren't familiar with it, is the concept of data being the basis of a lot of ethics and morality, and just the concept of sharing data, having more data and transparency is very, very important. And like John touched on that, to me, a lot of people think of blockchain as something which is more privacy or more, it's encrypted or that sort of thing. But my view on it is actually the opposite. If anything, it provides transparency because now you have shared ledgers, or you have data which everybody can see and they can actually verify independently that that data is actually valid. So it's an interesting concept, though, from the standpoint that one of the problems with dataism is that it conflicts largely with a lot of privacy legislation and concepts out there, because having data exposed is a different way of getting security. So often, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the whole privacy discussion right now, but privacy is a tool basically for giving you security or for giving you a result of some sort. But transparency can provide that same sort of result without privacy in many cases. So it's the concept of making data something which is autonomous, sovereign, and has its own value, and actually is elevated. So I was compared to like if you think about murder, for example, well, why is murder bad? It's not because you made a person's body stop functioning, it's because you erased the data set of their mind, and that data set's lost. So that's why, for example, if a person's brain dead, you could potentially unplug them without it being a crime, but making a person brain dead, for example, it would be considered murder because you erased that data set. So if you really distill it down to what do we value in humans, or what do we value in an entity? It's that data set that actually defines them as something. So that's really what dataism is about. It's looking at the data sets that define the world around us.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned privacy. So from a regulatory standpoint in Washington, that's really a major topic right now that's being discussed. And one of the primary areas of my association, the Chamber of Digital Commerce, is to, we focus on education with members of Congress, regulators, and their staff. And we're focusing on the development and promoting the growth of specific go-to-market use cases. And when we highlight those, it always makes our conversations with senators, congressmen, and regulators a lot more simple to break it down. And there's a lot of use cases that we can talk about: cross-border settlement, cybersecurity, border security. What are some of these, in your opinion, that we should focus on when we're speaking to regulators to bring it down and to talk about blockchain beyond just the financial services and cryptocurrency side? And what are some of the policy challenges you see that blockchain can solve really directly?
So I assume because you handed me the mic, you want me to start. I'm going to spin your question a little bit and say, actually, let's talk about some opportunities that it presents. And I'll speak, as an aircraft manufacturer, the certification of aircraft is step one to being able to execute some of these use cases in aviation. We're entering a new world of certification, right? The regulator, there's a lot of things new here, from electric motors to multicopters, to semi-autonomous flight behaviors, to non-deterministic systems. So there's a whole bevy of new certification challenges. We will get there, right? As a community, we will get to a certification basis for these new types of systems and new types of operations and new types of operators. But once you get there, now you need to be able to trace the history of each one of those entities through their daily operations. This is where DLT really, I think, shines. To be able to have, the equivalent of and we jokingly call it the drone fax, right? Where you can take a single ID for a single device and not only know that entire device's lineage all the way back to manufacturing, but who touched it along the way? What did they do with it? Who maintained it? What equipment did they use to fix it? This is a new level of traceability that I think is enabled by these kinds of technologies in the future that then actually have a reinforcing effect on the certification of the aircraft themselves. So I think, I'll stop there and let the other panelists opine, but I think when you start to pull the thread on those for the equipment, for the operators, the operators both in terms of the ones responsible for the flying things and the ones responsible for the business, because that's another part of regulation, then you can start to see how a distributed ledger and this kind of transparency and accountability really does bring a new level and a new opportunity for improving levels of safety in the aviation system.
I think that, that's a great point. I think I just want to distinguish one thing, which is that there's machine data and then there's personal data. So in the legal field, I guess we typically kind of classify data into different buckets and to determine what regulatory frameworks apply to those various buckets. And I totally agree with you that with respect to machine data, which is non-personal data for the most part, it's great to have a ledger that's very, very transparent and open and traceable. But I think when it comes to personal data, back to your question, Dan, about regulators, I think that's where there's a lot of still mental blockage in terms of thinking of blockchain as only related to cryptocurrency. And because of the sort of negative things that have happened and the negative publicity around, Bitcoin and the Silk Road and all of those, there's this concept of the fact that blockchain is used to mask identities for criminal behavior, whereas in reality, the way I look at it is that blockchain is privacy enhancing. It's a way to selectively disclose, but not in a way that necessarily automatically leads to criminality, but it's more that it's a method for people to become sovereign over themselves and their own data. And I think if we can explain that distinction to regulators and they can see the power of blockchain with respect to both personal and non-personal data, I think it's a win-win situation for society, as we've been talking about all these use cases that are truly beneficial. It's just a matter of figuring out how to, slightly, maybe not modify, but look at the regulatory frameworks in a different way as they're drafted now, it's quite difficult to apply the regulatory frameworks that exist, especially with respect to privacy, to the blockchain because of the way that they're drafted. They were set up with a different mindset, with a centralized mindset. So when you apply the centralized mindset to a decentralized system, you wind up with a result that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But the law is the law, so you have to try to figure out a way to work within the existing systems. And I think that is causing some innovation problems with advancing innovation, because obviously people don't want to violate the law on purpose, but the law is not allowing for progress in many ways in terms of privacy.
Well, one interesting thing you mentioned there, that the law is kind of murky right now. We found this out with the SEC and with the IRS and all those different things. We talk about cryptocurrency. And literally at this point, besides the fact that the pace and the clarity is very, very lacking from a regulatory standpoint, some of the laws which have been either enacted, like the GDRP or the new California Consumer Privacy Act, like the right to be forgotten, for example, is something which just is not possible on blockchain. So they make laws that are impossible to comply with. And then if you look at some of the other requirements, if you, the way that the SEC attorneys versus the SEC accountants versus the IRS accountants look at cryptocurrency, it's literally impossible to have a GAAP compliant accounting system for a company that actually complies with all the regulations which all the different parts of the government actually ask you to do. So it's the current state, because they've applied 1940s and 1950s laws to cryptocurrency, is such that it's literally impossible to actually not break the law, which is kind of problematic for companies as far as moving forward, because there's no malintent or no intention to break the law if you're constantly asking, well, am I breaking the law? And I don't know. It's really, really difficult to move forward. So it really, really slows it down. And then with the government shutdowns and the pace, we're literally at a point where by the time that we file a second filing with SEC, they are still reviewing and asking questions about the filing from the quarter before. So we're at least a quarter behind constantly in filings, which makes it even more difficult. So the pace and transparency is, I think, a huge problem for cryptocurrency. And I think it's largely because of the lack of understanding by people who are making the laws and the regulators and just applying. And also lack of case law. Like I always say, I wish somebody would take a lot of these issues to the Supreme Court. I just don't want to be that person because it's really expensive. But I wish somebody else would take it to the Supreme Court, like Boeing or somebody like that, with lots of money and with attorneys, and then we'll have the answers. Because I think most companies, like my own company, we don't really care what the answers are. We just want to know what they are. And so that that certainty is way more valuable than any sort of specific answer.
Yeah, I think to the credit has gotten slightly better. There's now Congressional Blockchain Caucus, which we co-founded a couple years back, and has grown considerably. It used to be just 2, now it's over 12, and they're open to hearing more about this technology. They're open to hearing more about the use cases behind it, and then also from the SEC, CFTC standpoint. I want to talk also more about this space too, from the autonomous unmanned systems. But how does that apply to in this increasingly autonomous world? Some of the work you're working on right now has an Oracle problem. I think it's what you coined. How is XPO solving this from that end?
Well, so one of the main problems that we see, and I think John touched on this with being able to share data between devices. If you go into a space or even into the room we're in here right now, there's probably 100 times as much data floating around this room right now, whether it's human data. You can look at there's genes for people's hairs falling on the ground or that sort of thing, or just digital data from people's phones and from all these different devices. And for me to be able to consume that data, if I can consume 1% of that data, it's a lot. Most of that data is data swamp that I can't actually access. And primarily, the reason I can't access it is because I don't know if I should trust it or not, right? If I see a SSID at the airport with some random name on it, I can't just use that. And so how do I actually trust data that's not something which has been centralized authority has told me is okay? So that's what XPO does. XPO basically wraps data, makes data self-sovereign. So when you get a piece of data, you can actually observe that data, and you can see that it's actually consistent and sovereign, and you can go and look at the peer verification of it. So basically, it's a peer verification audit trail that you end up getting out of it. And so it allows for people to be able to share data. So an example of it is, like, we're talking to some cities in San Diego and California, where what they want to do is they want to produce data for traffic and for traffic lights and for those sorts of things, but they want companies to use it like autonomous vehicles. But the problem is if you have 10,000 Teslas driving around a city in California and they're all trying to hit the server at the same time trying to get the data, it's kind of problematic. If that server goes down, they're all kind of stuck. But really what you want these cars to go and ask the same data from the traffic lights or from the local IoT devices, and then once they have it, even share it amongst themselves. So if one Tesla can give it to the next one and so on and so forth. But how do you prevent attacks in that case? Because there could be a civil attack where somebody goes and takes this data or produces fake data, and now I'm using data which is not true, and it causes my car to crash, right? So that's what XPO does, is basically we sign and we wrap data in cryptographic envelopes that allows you to tell that it still came from the same source that you expected it to come from. So if I got a packet from, say, the city of Carlsbad in San Diego, and I passed it to the next car and the next car and the next car, they all are comfortable it actually came from a safe source.
Anybody else have any input on that topic? By chance?
I think that what you're doing is really important because that is one of the main risks, I think, of blockchain is the security. The whole premise of blockchain technology, especially in this case where people's lives are at risk in the autonomous vehicle space, is that you need to be able to trust the data, and that's the fundamental premise. And if you can't trust the data, then I think the whole system becomes undermined. So I guess, I'm just wondering, how do you predict that there would ever be errors in the cryptographic envelope, and that it would be a possibility to have wrong data even with all the precautions?
Well, you can't really have errors as such. You have a hash which is unfakeable and signatures which go on that which are unfakeable. The only thing which you can do is I can make fake data and then sign it with something which is not trusted. So for me to actually spoof data from a city like Carlsbad, for example, or from something, I would have to get their private key to do that. So the risk, of course, like almost all blockchain things, is if somebody goes and gets their hands on all different private keys that are producing these things, now they can, of course, get into that system. But it's the same problem you have with any sort of a blockchain system, or even for that reason, a centralized system. If you can get to the source or origin of the data, and you become the majority of the information, because our system basically works on majority rule. The way I look at the world, back to kind of the dataism concept, is the definition of reality is what we all agree upon is reality. And so the only reason why a person is considered insane is just because their reality is sufficiently different from the realities which the majority of people actually have defined as the correct reality. So our system looks at data the same way, that if the majority of nodes in our system agree that a certain reality is true, that by definition is true in that given context, and you can have smaller context. So just like any blockchain system, if you can have a majority attack, if you have a 51% attack on us, somebody can produce 51% of all the data in a malicious way, they basically shifted reality to their own perception of reality. So it's still valid, it's just now a different reality. They've kind of warped.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to ask this question in terms of, I guess, predictions, years out. In terms of mobility, and we can start with you, John, where do you see American cities in the near future? Let's say 5 to 10 years out. A year and a half ago, there was no scooters, and now they're everywhere. And so it makes you wonder how quick things can happen. Will blockchain play an integral role in that as well?
So two parts to that, right? So kind of what's the view of the future for cities? And again, my answer will always be kind of slanted towards the aviation space because it's kind of what we do. There's a lot of hype out there about future urban mobility and what aviation and how it's going to change the landscape. There's absolutely no doubt that we are up against the wall when it comes to our abilities to expand our urban infrastructures to support the growth rate of population in those urban centers. So the demand is there. The challenge that we have in seeing a future urban aerial mobility really come to light is certification, which I already mentioned, regulation of the operations, and then finally, public perception. And I think this is how I'll segue into the second half of your question, and that revolves around privacy. Right? Not every flying thing has a camera, but there's a bit of a public perception that every flying thing does have a camera, or we don't know if it has a camera, right? So again, transparency and accountability. right? What's the purpose of any device that's flying? Is it carrying people? Is it carrying cargo? Is it actually carrying sensors or a camera? You know, these things that can be accessed by a stakeholder and viewed through a ledger, I think therein lies a tool that can be used to kind of get over this hurdle of public perception. Back to the first part of your question, you know, what do we see in terms of the growth rates? Well, largely the infrastructure itself is going to be a limiting factor in terms of the growth of urban air mobility and the distribution of flying things around cities. Rooftop operations might happen again in the future, but that has a checkered past. There have been some pretty well-known accidents that have happened in rooftops with helicopters. So I think there's a slow roll there in terms of distributed infrastructure that would support the kind of scale of operations that the demand would suggest could happen. So I think, combine all of those factors, will we see some urban air mobility in the next 10 years? Certainly. But it'll be specialized use cases, niche groups, kind of airport to some part of a city where it's, capable of supporting air traffic and the infrastructure exists. I don't know if that gave you enough on the blockchain side of it, but just it seemed like you were digging for a little bit of our view of the future, so that's what I was going to give you. Great.
You have any thoughts on that question in terms of where you think this is going, in terms of blockchain and just general mobility in the near future?
I mean, I definitely think that the prospect of having air mobility and autonomous vehicles, such as ride-sharing autonomous vehicles, is not too far away. I mean, in fact, it exists now. It's just not widely deployed. I think that as we've been mentioning, some of the key hurdles to advancement of a wider deployment of these technologies is probably on the regulatory side and the public perception side. So I think until we can manage those two challenges, which are arguably intertwined, I think it will still be maybe a few years before we see truly universal deployment of autonomous technologies throughout our various cities.
Thoughts on that?
Well, I think the pace of this is very much related to the data question and the risk of us getting into kind of this data dark ages, because a lot of these problems are easily solvable if we kind of start throwing out privacy out the window from the standpoint if you have cars that have cameras on them so they can see where they're going, or UAVs or that sort of thing. If they all have access to the cameras on the piers on the street, they'll have access to the cameras on the rooftops and so on and so forth, and those cameras are open and they show what's there. The ability to actually make them safer is way, 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 way higher, because we think of it as we're humans, we only have two eyes, we can see one thing at a time. But fortunately, machines, if you give it 100 cameras, it can actually process all that data from the 100 cameras. But I'm sure, if you're building a drone of some sort that's going to land on a roof, that for you to actually get real-time feeds from the roof and from other drones or from who was there just now, where the car has two cars in front of you, like that Tesla which sideswiped the barrier a little bit on the freeway, if it could have seen that barrier from the car, two cars ahead of itself very easily. But I think the fact that it's so prohibitive to get this data makes it really difficult to actually make the system work, because really, you need a mesh. You don't just need, making standalone autonomous vehicles really difficult. You want to make a system which actually is an autonomous vehicle system, but that then gets to the privacy, gets to all these different sensor questions.
So do you have any questions from the audience? I have a few more that I'd like to cover, but I'd love to hear some input. And this gentleman back here, let's go ahead and start with him.
A very interesting discussion. I haven't heard any conversation about the overhead involved with blockchain, since it imposes a lot of computing power in order to complete it. So that's sort of one issue, and as you deal with that by making it more secure, then you have the latency question. So if you're going to apply it in terms of autonomous things, getting that information in time to do something is another issue. So cost and latency.
Well, I can speak to those. The cost issue, I think, is something which is going away. Your proof of work, obviously, is something which is very, very cost inefficient. Bitcoin is probably going to be long-term the only blockchain out there with a central or a shared ledger that's going to use proof of work, because it's like it's the asset store. But Ethereum and most other blockchains are moving towards proof of stake or other sorts of ways to be able to have a centralized ledger or shared ledger that is not as resource intensive. But there are still some issues as far as everybody has to have the same copy of all the data, and so there's a lot of inefficiencies. The system which XPO uses is substantially different. We don't actually use a consensus-based system where we have a centralized ledger or a shared ledger. What we do is we have individual ledgers that are on all of our different devices, and all of our IoT devices, and then they have pure signatures for the different blocks and different data points. So it's a much more of a mesh or a tangle of a bunch of different blockchains stuck together. So from a pragmatic standpoint, it's a lot more efficient. The one downside of that, though, is you mentioned latency in there. So latency becomes an issue for real-time performance, where for us to verify that this data is consistent with the majority of the data that's in our system is something which takes a little bit longer because you have to be able to go and refer to previous data. So it's an ongoing thing which you have to do on that device. But I think, like any technology out there, the first version is going to be pretty archaic. If you look at the efficiency of the Model T Ford compared to the jet engines that are being put on airplanes now, I'm pretty sure the orders of magnitude different. Or if you look at my TRC Model 1 from 1979 compared to my cell phone, we'll solve the problems of, I think, those efficiencies and those latency issues. It's just really, really, really early in the time frame for this technology.
So I agree with everything you just said, and I would add another layer to your question. It's actually, from a compute standpoint, pretty confident that capacity to compute is on the right track, right? Moore's law is in our favor there. From a latency standpoint in the aviation world, the aviation system is actually designed today to be pretty robust to a certain amount of latency. I mean, considering the fact that we actually separate aircraft in the air with 1950 simplex radio communications kind of tells you that the system is reasonably robust to that. The challenge that I think, or at least from our perspective, is more on the communications networks that enable all of these nodes to share that data. And that is an interesting one because the nature of the devices that we see being employed range from a tiny little handheld thing that you might use for some robotic chores around your house to a passenger carrying air vehicle to an airliner. Each one of those platforms has a decidedly different capacity for size, weight, power, and cost. So how can you actually deploy communications technologies that allows you to share this data that is, that we've talked about this whole session around, ensuring privacy and, transparency and lineage, if you can't actually move the data across the nodes in the network? So I think it's a very interesting question, and I would just say that yes, and the communication bits, I think, become rapidly more critical.
Yeah, just to add on to that, actually, Dan and I were talking about this a bit earlier, is that, the communications angle of things, as more and more devices become connected, that's truly critical. Traditionally, in the United States, at least, the FCC has been the regulator for communications, but, those have been more traditional, broadband and communications, and now with IoT devices, where every device is essentially emitting, you need to broaden the viewpoint of how you look at communications and how it's important to the deployment and development of various technologies, especially in light of 5G and other kind of technologies coming down the pipe. I think with respect to how we make communications efficient, a lot of it will come down to interoperability standards and making sure that all the different devices are able to communicate on a sort of universal standard. Otherwise, the promise of a lot of what we've talked about, of cars talking to one another, kind of goes away if they can't talk to each other on the same standard and transmit that data to other cars or other people or devices or things of that nature.
Can I mention one thing? So I think one thing also that's important is to remember that if we do get a network where all these things are talking, making sure that each of the items in there are autonomous and singularly able to function without the communication, because the simplest attack on a system like that is a cone of silence attack, where basically if you just jam all the radio waves or all different communications, you're not doing any spoofing or any sort of bad data, but if you just cut off that communication, if everything crashes because they can't talk to each other anymore, that's a really bad thing. So they all have to at least have a fallback, spin down, or land safety, or that sort of thing. So I think Singularly autonomous vehicles is something which is always going to be very important as well, even if we get the network to go.
You have another question? Yeah, right here. Go ahead.
So I can see a lot of reason to have digital signatures on data so that we can trust, for example, the FAA declares an air exclusion zone around a certain area, so that we can trust that with the FAA. But what I'm not getting strongly, and maybe I just missed it, is the need for a distributed ledger in this kind of world. Like, why do I need trustable sequences of operations rather than just, I agree with trusting, the source of the data, but I don't understand how a blockchain adds anything beyond digital signatures.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I'll start. And so our view of it is really the historical logging of, not just the systems, not just the players, but the specific transactions and the actions that occurred in the system. So the example I'll use that hopefully sheds some light, at least from our perspective, is as we look towards future air traffic management, clearly the human can't be in the loop of that. There will have to be a certain level of autonomy and most likely artificial intelligence to handle the dynamic rerouting, how to react to shock, how do we remanage the network and the system. So decisions are going to be made. The delegation to make those decisions is going to be granted to machines at some level. We're going to need to know which factors led up to specific decisions by those systems. And this is where a trusted distributed ledger, from our perspective, is really useful, because no single entity in that chain can change that record without all of the other entities, or at least the majority of entities, agreeing. That's really interesting from an aviation perspective, because now it gives us not single points of failure in the logging of said systems. It's actually distributed and can be cross-checked. So hopefully that sheds some light, at least from the Boeing perspective.
Well, yeah, I do agree with your sentiment that I think that shared ledgers is not the solution for everything. I think a lot of people think it's a hammer for every nail. In our system, for example, we don't use shared ledgers or consensus for pretty much anything. We use it to integrate into Ethereum for smart contracts, but beyond that, each of our devices actually has its own blockchain, and that blockchain does not require consensus because it's my blockchain and it has a series of signatures which basically links together so I can show it's mathematically secure in the context of my one device. And then all the blockchains on there, all the blocks on there are basically co-signed with one other device out in the system. So you end up with this matrix, but it doesn't require a shared ledger or some sort of distributed ledger for that case. It's just, the consistency is by design as opposed to by consensus. And so I think people often they think of blockchain as defined by decentralized or distributed ledgers, and I think blockchain as a cryptographically signed linked list is really almost more powerful in many ways than actually the ledgers that are out there. And for currency, you need to have a decentralized ledger, but if you look at humans, each person has their own timeline, and your interactions with other people are events that basically can be co-opted in, by memories from other people and that sort of thing. So we've really modeled our system much more after like human interactions and the way that humans behave in the world. And humans don't have a giant shared ledger.
I think I'll just add one plug for the shared ledger. In your example where you're talking about the FAA digital signature, for example, in a use case such as a supply chain, if you have an item that's being shipped that's been certified as, by a government agency as being ready to be shipped and it meets all the standards, and then it goes to all these different points. At each checkpoint, it's important for those, people who are managing those checkpoints, or maybe robots, to know that package has been certified and meets all these various standards. And I think blockchain is just one way of having a ledger by which that data can be shared in real time, and everyone can see that cryptographic stamp of the FAA or whatever agency we're talking about is attached at each checkpoint. So you kind of have a chronological way of ensuring that, the various certifications for this imaginary shipment that I'm talking about has been met.
We have another question over here. No? Okay. Okay, so the legal questions that this gentleman actually had asked, one of the questions I was going to ask is, a blockchain necessary for all industries in all cases? And in some cases it's not. But from a legal standpoint, in the autonomous vehicles and unmanned space, what should companies be thinking of right now going forward, whether it has to do with artificial intelligence as well? That came up in the conversation briefly. From your perspective, Charlyn.
So just to repeat the question, so
what legal issues should companies, many of which maybe are here today, should be aware of or preparing for in this space when it comes to blockchain technology?
I mean, I think the legal issues you should be prepared for are understanding how you're deploying or utilizing the blockchain so that you know what legal regimes govern. I think that's part and parcel of the problem, is that blockchain is meant to be a distributed ledger whereby you could have multiple legal regimes governing at the same time. So for example, if you have a bunch of nodes in various countries and they're all communicating with each other, one of the problems as a practitioner in the law is trying to identify what legal regime governs, and therefore how can we advise our clients to comply. So I think our first question to our clients is, well, how does your system work? What is your intent? Where do you want to deploy it? What are you using it for? What are you collecting? So we kind of have a set of questions that we go through, and most of our clients that are have already thought through this, it just makes our jobs that much easier. And if they've implemented a privacy by design, I know I keep talking about privacy, but that's because that's sort of my area of focus approach. It's just so much more streamlined for them to fit into a model because they've designed their system from the ground up, understanding that the law is what it is. We can all hope that it's not that way, or we can hope that government agencies move faster, but that isn't the reality. So I think that my advice to companies out here is just plan ahead, understand that legal is part of the development, and since we are in a murky regulatory regime, erring on the side of conservativeness is probably better from at least a legal liability standpoint.
Any thoughts on that?
I have a question actually for you to kind of follow. How do you deal with the question of which body actually is the controlling, or the correct one? It seems like whenever you ask a question of whose purview is this, every country and every agency in every country raises their hand. So how do you actually know who, like if you have to follow one or the other, how do you actually sort the order of jurisdictions?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think it depends on what law we're talking about. To be honest, for example, I do a lot of work on, as you mentioned, the GDPR and the CCPA, and both of those laws are long arms statutes where they essentially have an extraterritorial reach. So in other words, even though you aren't operating in Europe or you aren't operating in California, those statutes essentially kind of long arm and kind of pull people in. So in some instances, you could have a blockchain that could be subject to both, for example. And it may result in an inconsistent outcome whereby a CCPA analysis and a GDPR analysis result in different conclusions. And our job as your counsel, for example, to answer the hypothetical question would be to advise on what's the way to best meet the intent of both laws. And then probably as a corollary, we would be lobbying with the various jurisdictions to help them understand that it's not in their best interest, it's not even in the spirit of the law for there to be this type of inherent conflict.
Do panelists have any other questions to one another before we move forward? That was a good one. Back here.
I'm really ignorant, so let me ask a question. It may be dumb, but in terms of a lot of these technologies, I'm thinking UAS technologies, what triggered this was you're thinking about nodes in different countries. Do you run into ITAR ear issues? I know that the core I live in, so I have to be real careful when I'm communicating, with foreign nationals or if they're talking about that. Do you get that with data? I would think you might.
It's surprising it took that long for the I word to come out.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes, you have to be extremely careful, especially as the ITAR itself is evolving around the technologies used in this space. It wasn't that long ago that a solid state IMU was a munition on that list, right? So the good news is I think we are seeing evolution in the definitions of the ITAR. Probably the scariest space of the ITAR, well, there's three parts of it, right? Forgive me for oversimplifying. There's the list itself, there's the munitions list, right? Then there are services that you provide to people which give them some insight around how America does defense stuff. And then there's this amazingly amorphous definition of technical data. And that's the scary bit, because as you have these distributed systems that are recording and transmitting and logging all sorts of information, whether that's related to the telemetry of the aircraft, whether that's related to the environment they're flying in, whether it's related to things they're observing on the ground, it is, I believe, inevitable that you will cross the boundaries of the existing definition of the ITAR. I don't think there's a clean path through this. I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error, for a lack of a better way to do it, not to sound like people aren't thinking diligently about how to address this, but I just think that it's such a gray area, especially in this regime of aviation, that all parties involved are going to have to continually work to evolve that regulation while still protecting the intent of it.
I mean, I think just one corollary to ITAR is export-import control laws. You know, that's another area where data is regulated that potentially, very likely, would be implicated in the context of a global blockchain.
Can I ask a follow-up question for you there? So there's like a lot of blockchain companies seem to think of jurisdiction in different ways. One is where the users are. One is where the data is. And so like some states, for example, like Wyoming and Utah and West Virginia are trying to have more blockchain-friendly laws, for example, but they're still in the U.S., so the federal laws will be there. And then there's the transmission of the data across the lines and that sort of thing. Like, so even people are putting blockchain in space to kind of try to get well, if the packets are in space, like whose jurisdiction does that fall under? What do you think, who will win as far as like what will define the jurisdiction of those three different heuristics?
I mean, another very great question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. So for example, the way that we look at it is that we take whatever law it is that is implicated, and then we break that law down into the relevant tests. And then we look at each component of the blockchain and how the law would apply. Like as an example, with GDPR, we look at where the nodes are. We look at the type of blockchain, whether it's permissioned, permissionless, public, private blockchain. The greater the level of centralization, so the more permissioned, private, and the more towards that side of the spectrum, the more likely whoever it is that's the central organization that creates the governance would be a quote-unquote controller under that regime. So I'm just giving this as an example because it depends on how the law sets up the applicability test, because every law has a certain series of criteria that need to be met in order for the law to apply. So we essentially take that and then we look at that and then we kind of break down the components of the blockchain, the nodes, the users, the data, all of that, and it all goes into an analysis. And hopefully we conclude that either the law does not apply, so therefore you're exempt, or we conclude that it does apply and here's how you would have to meet those obligations. Does that help?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Christy Karen with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I'll preface this by saying that everything I know about blockchain I learned in the last 45 minutes, so forgive me if this is a simple question. I understand the forensic uses of blockchain from an aviation perspective, but how about for real-time operations? What does it enable in terms of that?
So I certainly cannot answer this from the technical implementation perspective, so I'm at great risk of embarrassing myself. What I will say is from the practical application, and I'll look to Arie to add to this because I think that's the expert up here in terms of technologies. But I think there is a cybersecurity component here in the real-time domain that is very interesting, because if you do have a way to trust the communications and the actors in a system, so think future air traffic management, then theoretically it should become easier to spot the anomalous actor, right? Maybe you can't label as bad in real time, but you can label as anomalous, and therefore, reduce the priority of reacting to said message or whatever it is. So I think it's early days for us in terms of exploring the implementation of this, but that's certainly one of the areas where we think there is promise in the future, is in the application of cybersecurity to these types of distributed management systems, in our case for air traffic management.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know about the aircraft specifically, but I think the security of it, knowing where it came from. We also can improve performance, because in some cases you have to go back to a central authority to validate the data to know where it came from. So if you can actually look at the data as a self-sovereign data piece, and I can tell it's valid without having to go and ask anybody else whether it's valid, kind of a zero knowledge proof, then I can actually react to it much more rapidly, as opposed to I get a piece of data and now I have to go and check to see if it's valid or not. I can see it's valid by face value. And also sequencing is very important, so you can tell if there's missing data, if there's corrupt data, kind of like a CRC or a normal hash would be, but you can't get that for free with blockchain. You have a way to tell that data has been either tampered with or has been just failed somehow, or has been missing. So I think there's a lot of things in the real-time aspect where it would be better with this, but it does also require multiple parties to obviously use the system. One party using a blockchain is not going to get you very far.
Okay, I think we have one more question here from this gentleman. Yeah.
Great. So thank you. This has been a great discussion. Yeah. So my name is Sudhir Pai, and I've spent all of my life in the energy industry. Obviously, I come from the energy capital of the world, Houston, Texas. Yeah. So the two other industries which makes up, so I'll give you a quick 30-second background, and that will help ask the question, right? Two other industries which Houston is known for. One is known much better. Houston, we don't have a problem, which is space, Johnson Space Center at NASA. And the other, which is, there are more doctors in 1 square mile called the Texas Medical Center than anywhere else on Earth. I think it's a little known fact. So all these things have, plus nature is driving us because of the stuff which happened with Hurricane Harvey. So all this stuff is making our city in general, but particularly our mayor, Sylvester Turner, to lead Houston as the smart city of the world, right? And a few other industries like Microsoft, etc., have jumped onto this bandwagon. Obviously, I've heard some mention about it, and from this panel, I would like to know, obviously with all of this stuff, starts the interpretation of what is smart city, right? So maybe as an ending question, going beyond the details that you said, at let's say a 30,000 feet view, what would be your interpretation of what smart city is? Some of this stuff is critical, and thank you again for this great discussion, because I think it helps us take it back and add it into the stuff that we are doing. Some of the things like robotics, cybersecurity, data science, etc., are some of the key pillars which have already been set up to help lead to where we are.
So, one thing that's interesting is you mentioned smart city. So, I think a lot of people confuse smart and connected. And I can see, yes, every year I go to look for smart home stuff, and I see a lot of connected home stuff. And I think a lot of cities are showing that right now. They've connected a bunch of things. They have all this data, these sensors, and traffic lights, but they're struggling to go from connected to smart. And that's really the leap which they're trying to make. Is how do I make my connected city a smart city? And I think it's actually difficult. You need AI. You need to be able to take this data and process it into something which is useful. Generate metadata from video, for example. You need to be able to trust data from these different sources. You need to be able to homogenize data into one sort of format that everyone can understand and share. So I think that the challenge is, back to my dataism side of things, I think that a lot of the challenges that we're facing, and one of the reasons why IoT I feel has not gone as far as it needs to or could go, is end up with these silos. And like if you look at a smart home right now, try to get an Alexa and Google Home and Apple TV all to work together. It's almost impossible because they don't speak the same language. And so I think solving the data problem solves so many other problems. And so that's how I think we go from smart city or smart fill in the blank to, or sorry, connected city to smart city. And
I think that's another area where peer-to-peer transactions help reduce the potential of monopolies of big companies, like the ones you mentioned, have essentially a monopoly over technological standards. So with peer-to-peer, in a smart city, you can have different devices and people talk to one another without going through an Apple or a Google or a insert whatever company. And I think that is going to be very, very important to unblock the development, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of special interests of every individual company wanting to have their own standard, and then you're going to have a bunch of companies that their technologies can't talk to one another. I mean, unless there's collaboration, and of course, these companies are all important in advancing the discussion, but unless it's done in a collaborative way with single standards, I think the problem that Arie just mentioned is just going to become exacerbated.
So I'll finish by adding that, so we're smart city. I think the gentleman over here asked the question, why blockchain? I think it's really good. Like, ask the question, right? What does that mean, right? What are we really talking about when we ask about smart city? So our answer to that question is that we're looking at the multimodal transportation of people and goods in an urban environment, right? So certainly there's the control point aspect of the cities themselves providing the horizontal layer of infrastructure and services and capabilities needed to make that multimodal vision a reality. But I think it also comes to kind of demand modeling and prediction of that demand. If everybody had siloed and proprietary access to specific vertiports, let's say, you're probably not actually solving the congestion problem. In fact, you might be making it worse because you're introducing a new control point and choke point into the already stressed system. So if elements of that infrastructure were both open and somewhat intelligent in terms of communication, but also some predictive in terms of demand patterns, well, then the players in that system can more rapidly redistribute the capabilities to provide that multimodal transportation of people and goods. So I agree with everything you guys said. And from the practical application, it's really about, okay, how do we use that kind of connected and smart infrastructure to increase the efficiency of the system overall?
Well, thank you very much for the distinguished panel and for the fantastic questions from the audience discussing this very nascent industry. Next year, 1 year from now, when we're back, who knows what we'll be talking about when it comes to blockchain. This is a very rapidly moving space. But I just want to thank everybody again for attending, the panelists and the audience. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.